And here we are on rates. A rate is a type of ratio used to compare different types of quantities. So I want you to look back. All the units they wrote up here were the same. Now is going to be the kind of rates you're more used to, where they're different units. And then there are several English keywords that imply a rate somewhere. So per is the one we see all the time, miles per hour. Then 4 is for pricing, $25 for 9 pounds, or 9 pounds for $25. Like, people will say that either way, but when we want a usable rate, we usually want the money on top because we want to know how many dollars per item. And then in, this thing can go 100 meters in 9.58 seconds. Whew. Maybe it's an animal, maybe it's a person. And then on, 194 miles on 9 gallons of gas. So if I wanted to know how many miles in 1 gallon, I can mess around with that bottom one until I get a 1 on the bottom. And that's what we're going to see in a second on that units rates. You can see peeking on the bottom. But here, we're going to write them as a fraction, and we're going to focus on the units. In the previous one, when the units were the same, technically the units cancel out. Unless they were talking about like cups of flour, cups of sugar, like the cups parts reduces and we just have parts, but we still would want to keep flour with one number, sugar with the other. Here now, they're not even the same units. They're totally different units, but we can still reduce the number part and then maybe get a result that's more usable to us. So Dexter can run 8 miles in 48 minutes. Good job, Dexter. All right, so let me zoom in a little because I write so big. So 8 miles, 48 minutes. We use MI for miles because we use M for meters. All right, so 8 and 48, those are actually both divisible by 8. 48 is 6/8. And then 8 is, of course, 1/8. So this reduces to 1 mile per 6 minutes. So Dexter can run 1 mile in 6 minutes. Now in Mathland, we don't worry about speeding up and slowing down when we talk about these kind of rates. We just make the assumption that we're talking about an average rate. Even though we know in reality, like the first mile is going to be a different amount of time from the last mile. This is just average it all out on average. What do they do? Number 13, Axel writes 9 sections of a book in 15 days. Damn, that. I hope sections are big. All right, so they told us sections first, so we'll go with that on top. Here we go, 9 sections in 15 days. 9 and 15, those should hopefully be familiar numbers. 9 is 3 times 3, 15 does have a 3 in it. So if I divide both of those by 3, I now have 3 to 5. 3 sections in 5 days. All right. Benazir's income increased by $6,183 over 18 months. Well, this might beg the question, well, how much was it per month? Also, where can I get a job with that kind of increase? Because if that was the increase, what was the base pay? I mean, my God, this person's making money. All right. $6183 per 18 months. which we usually MO or MOS for months. Okay, that number's bigger than 2 digits. I get the calculator out. So coincidentally, if you do have to take a calculator-free test, ask your teacher how big the numbers are going to get, especially if you have a problem with doing some numbers by hand. Always fair game to ask the teacher about that, because we do not want you guys to freak out and stress because you have a problem making the numbers stay still. Like, math dyslexia is totally a thing and it is rarely diagnosed, but this is the kind of situation where if you do have it, it's going to show up. So if you think that is something you have, you can talk to the Office of Disability Services, which is shortened to ODS. And usually they can't do much, but offering you more time, and if it gets classified severe enough, like sometimes it'll be, you can have a basic 4-function calculator. All right, let's see what we got here with the 6183. Divided by 18, let's just straight divide it. Okay, it doesn't straight divide, but I'm gonna write what we did get because I still wanna see this number. So the straight division gave us 343.5, and that was dividing 18 completely into the top, so that would give us just 1 month on the bottom. Now I know the top is money, so I'm going to sneak that 0 in there. So $343.50 per month. That is on average how much Benazir's income increased. I wish. And just like 1 or 2 of those, and I would be feeling so much better. And I know a lot of y'all compared to me, like, I'm making bank, but I also have bigger bills. Not student loans yet, thank God. Don't look forward to those either. All right. This answer, though, we could not put into Alex because they said fraction and lowest terms. Lowest terms is assumed to be whole numbers. The 0.50 here, if I multiply by 2, then that 0.50 will become a 1 and everything else will be a whole number. So that is what we're going to do here. We're going to multiply by 2 over 2. So we are going to figure out the amount per 2 months. So for every 2 months times 2, 687. Now, me personally, I think the 343.50 per 1 month is more meaningful than the 2-month rate, but in the strictest math sense, 687 per 2 months is all whole numbers. Now, our last one, there are 4,211 pages in the 7 volumes of the novel In Search of Lost Time. How about In Search of Better Bookbinding? Because they called that a singular novel, so that is somebody who made a really long novel that couldn't be bound in 1 volume. George R.R. Martin, anyone? All right, but pages per volume. We can figure out, on average, how many pages are in each volume. Well, assuming 4211 is divisible by 7, which I don't think it is, actually. Because 42 is, so that would leave us with 11, which is not. But we can figure out what the unit rate would be as a little preview. 4211 divided by 7. Yep, nope. 601.57 blah, 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 blah. I don't like 7 fractions. So this is actually the most reduced because 7 is prime. So if 7 doesn't divide into the top nicely, there aren't any other numbers to consider. But just for your information, this would be 601.57 pages per 1 volume. So each volume has around 600 pages Now, realistically, I mean, that would be like counting all the Harry Potters. If you ever look at a collection of Harry Potter, it's like skinny, skinny, little bit bigger, super fat. So certainly the average of pages of the total number of pages divided by 7 is not, it gives you an average, but you know the first couple are not that long and the last ones are more than. But that does lead us into our unit rates. So our reduced fraction answers didn't have as much meaning as figuring out, well, what if my 1 was on the bottom? What does that tell me? And we see those rates and use those rates very often. So a rate having a denominator of 1 is called a unit rate. Furthermore, the number 1 is often omitted in the denominator. Like, my car gets 22.1 miles per gallon. I got a hybrid, mine actually gets a little bit better. Or $1.28 per ounce. So to convert a rate to a unit rate, you just divide the two numbers, and then whatever that result is, you put on top, and you put a 1 on the bottom, or you just erase, don't put a number on the bottom, which is what we did for our pages per volume up here. If I just erase the 1, then it's a unit. Well, even with the 1, it's a unit rate. All right. Of the following rates, identify those that are unit rates. 6 miles per 1 hour. Remember, can have a 1. Sometimes the 1 is omitted, but it doesn't have to be a unit rate. So 16 is a unit rate. $45 per visit. Do we think that is per 1 visit? It is indeed. 17 is also a unit rate. 91 books per 4 shelves. Why? That is not a unit rate because we're talking about 4 shelves. These must have been Harry Potter books where some are skinnier than others because 91 does not divide by 4 nicely. And then 56 oranges per box. That's a big box. But that is indeed also a unit rate. Next, we have write each rate as a unit rate and round to the nearest hundredth when necessary. So on these, we may get answers that are decimals, and that's okay. We want to know what the unit rate is, the per 1 thing. So our $8.95 earned in 2 weeks. We're just going to divide 8.95 divided by 2, top divided by bottom. And we get 447.5 per, this would now be 1 week. Okay, but the 447.5, check your units as money. So because that is money, we're going to tack a 0 on there, so it's 0.50 because we like to see 2 digits for cents. Make sense? I know I tell dad jokes. It's, I think one of the downsides of being a single mom is you have to make up for the bad dad jokes. All right. Next, we have at the grocery, milk costs $2.89 for half a gallon. This must be up on the East Coast because it don't cost that much here. So $2.89 for a half a gallon. Well, let's write it down. $2.89 per. Now you could write 0.5 for half, or you could write 1/2 the fraction. Either works. I'm going to go ahead with the half as a fraction. So to type this on the calculator, again, you could either use 0.5 instead of the 1/2, or you have to make sure you put the 1/2 in parentheses when you're typing. Or we could do it by hand and you actually just end up multiplying by 2. But here we go, 2.89 divided by open, 1 divided by 2 close. So we have, hopefully that is readable. What did we get? 5.78. And that is money per gallon. So assuming the rate would hold true, which if you've ever looked at milk prices doesn't, that would probably actually end up being written as $5.69 a gallon, or maybe even $5.49 a gallon. They give you a little more of a discount. The obnoxious thing is, though, what they're trying to do is they get you to buy more, but then the milk spoils before you use it all. So you actually ended up wasting $2 because you didn't drink all the milk. But you were trying to save money. Yeah. Money is annoying like that. Or rather, the way people market and sell is annoying. All right. Michael Phelps won 22 medals in 3 Olympic Games. Round to the nearest whole medal. All right, so 22 medals in 3 games. And so we're going to just straight up divide 22 divided by 3, and we get 7.33333. They told us to round to the nearest whole medal. So 3 is less than 5. It's less than our halfway mark. So that's going to stay as 7. So I'm going to put the wiggly lines, which means approximately 7 medals per Olympic game. Pretty good. And then our last one, Warner Brothers earned $7.7 billion in 8 Harry Potter movies. Yeah, we're not going to talk about the way movie industry money works. We'll just crunch the numbers. So 7.7 billion as a word, 8 movies. So we're just going to crunch 7.7 divided by 8. And we get 0.9625. So I'm going to write that down here. But our original directions told us to round to the nearest hundredth. All right, so 0.962. That is not past our 5 mark, our halfway mark. So this is going to stay 0.96 billion per movie with the $sign up here. Now again, that is the average, not what actually happened, because they made far more money on the last ones than they did on the first ones. Maybe not the first one, though. I think a lot of people saw the first one more than once, maybe. I don't know. That was years ago. I was in college. It was one of my first dates with my ex. Me. I don't blame Harry Potter for that. Blame my ex. Now, unit cost. This is one of the most common ways we use unit rates. So unit cost or unit price is the cost per 1 unit of something. So we saw that earlier with the dollars per gallon when we were pricing the milk. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to figure out what the 1 number would be. And we can figure out the price per single item. All right. So Publix, that is a grocery store in other parts of the country where they don't have HEB. Feel bad for them. Brand ice cream costs $4.59 for 64 ounces. So we want to figure out how much 1 ounce is. Yeah, because we can totally buy 1 ounce ice cream. All right. 4.59 divided by 64. Come back, calculator. 4.59 divided by 64 is a huge, ugly number. 3 decimal places. So this is 0.07171, blah, blah, blah. So 0.0717, but 1, 2, the 1 is actually the third decimal place, and that 7 afterwards is above our 5, our halfway mark. So it's going to round up to 0.072. So I'm just going to erase to put that in. And that is money, dollars. So that is not cents. I know it is very tempting to read it that way, but it is not the same. And there's a giant rant to a phone company about the difference between those. We could convert it to cents, but this one is $0.072 per ounce. That is how we would read it, even though it is less than $1. That is dollars. It would be 7.2 cents per ounce. Now, the good news is you just write it with the dollar sign. You don't have to worry about how to say it. All right, so a package of 7 t-shirts costs $10.89. All right, so how much is one t-shirt, roughly? Well, again, when we're finding unit cost, the money number goes on top, is usually the way we write it. Really, it just means take the money number divided by the things you're talking about. So here, 10.89 per 7. That is going to be ugly. Maybe it'll divide by 7. You know, I could be surprised. No, it doesn't. So we got to 1.5557, 3 decimal places. All right. 1.5557, blah, blah, blah. 1, 2, 3. So the number after the 7 is above the 5 mark. So this would go up 1, so 1.556. So each t-shirt costs approximately $1.556 per t-shirt. Alex will usually, either they will just flat out type the units for you, or they'll give you drop-down boxes where you choose it. So you very rarely have to type in units yourself, which is a nice thing because there's like little things you can do that'll mess up the units and it'll confuse most, like Math Lab got confused with it all the time. Because they're like, yeah, obviously everybody will just use lowercase m and some people would put a capital or some people would write out the word. Yeah. All right, now we got paint. Purple sounds good for paint. Paint for 200 square feet costs $90.39. 200 square feet is pretty big though. All right, so money on top. 90.39 over 200. That won't be too bad because dividing by 100 just moves the decimal. So we have 0.45195. 0.4519 is going to go up to 2. So this is about 45 cents per square foot. And then some people actually write SQFT instead of foot squared, just so that way it like looks the way it reads. But 27, the reason we talk about unit cost is for this kind of thing. We've got artichokes coming in 2 different size cans. A 54.4 ounce one and a 14 ounce one. The larger can costs $21.75, good Lord, and the smaller can costs $2.36. Find the unit cost of each can and then which one is the better buy. The answer to that is it depends on what you're making. If you were going to use 54 ounces really quickly, most of the time it's the better deal. It may not be though, because 14 compared to 54, like that's not 10 times, but $2.36 compared to $21 is almost 10 times. So looks like the smaller can is actually the better deal here, but we will figure it out. So 21.75 over 54.4. Nope. Yeah. Divided by 54.4. We got 0.39981. So for right now, I'm just going to write, oh no, they said 3 decimal places. So that one is the 3rd decimal place. And then the number after is above the halfway mark, above 5. So that's going to go up, which goes up, which goes up. So this actually becomes 0.400. In chemistry, you would definitely write those zeros. In math, that's dollars per ounce. All right, let's see what happens on the other one. 236 per 14 ounces. Oh yeah, like I said, I didn't think it was going to be the big can. 0.1685, blah, blah, blah. So $0.169 per ounce. Smaller can is the better buy, which is just as well, because I can't think of a recipe that would use 54 ounces of artichokes unless you were making like super size spinach artichoke dip. And even then, it's usually not 54 ounces. Not if you're making it with all the cheese. All right, that is it for our rates. Very useful. The nice thing is the grocery store a lot of times will actually configure the unit price for you, and they put it on the little barcode on the shelf. So there's like the full price, and then it'll have a 54 cents per ounce. Or sometimes they'll calculate it like they might tell you it's 27.2 cents per diaper, because that is something they will do for diapers at least. But sometimes they just they leave it alone and they don't calculate it per ounce. They're just like, and it's the same thing per bottle because there's only one bottle. That's when I always question, like, okay, then the bigger one is probably not the better deal here. Let's crunch some numbers. All right. I'll catch you guys on the flip side.